December 28, 1943, above Osnabrück, Germany. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler's gloved hand tightened on the throttle of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 as he pushed the fighter into a steep climb, chasing the contrails of American bombers returning from a raid deep into the Reich. At 15,000 feet, his engine was singing. At 18,000 feet, it was straining. At 22,000 feet, the Daimler-Benz 605 engine gasped for air in the thin atmosphere, losing power with every meter of altitude gained. Then he saw them, twin-boomed silhouettes cutting through the sky at 25,000 feet, escorting the bomber stream with an ease that should have been impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans called them Lightnings, Lockheed P-38 seconds. The Luftwaffe had been told these aircraft were inadequate for European combat. Too large, too complex, prone to engine failure in the cold. Stigler watched as one of the Lightnings rolled into a dive, accelerating past him before he could even bring his guns to bear. The twin Allison engines left vapor trails that seemed to mock every assumption German fighter tacticians had made about Allied aircraft capabilities. What Stigler didn't know that frozen December morning was that those P-38 seconds were operating at performance levels German engineers had calculated were aerodynamically impossible for a twin-engine fighter. The turbo superchargers spinning inside those engine nacelles were compressing air at altitudes where German fighters suffocated, delivering power that transformed the Lightning from a questionable design into the aircraft that would escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The story of how one American aircraft manufacturer's commitment to an unproven technology created the Luftwaffe's high-altitude nightmare begins not in combat, but in the technical competitions and design philosophies that shaped fighter development in the late 1930s. The United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X608 on February 23, 1937. The specification demanded something unprecedented: a high-altitude interceptor capable of 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, with a climb rate of 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, a service ceiling above 35,000 feet, and endurance for at least 1 hour at maximum continuous power. These requirements exceeded the performance of every fighter aircraft, then flying anywhere in the world. The proposal attracted submissions from 5 manufacturers: Curtiss, Bell, Vultee, Consolidated, and Lockheed. All believed they could meet the specifications. Only one design would succeed, and its success would rest on a technology that most aviation experts considered too complex, too heavy, and too unreliable for fighter aircraft. The turbo supercharger. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation's Burbank, California facility had never built a military fighter. The company's experience consisted of commercial transports and light civilian aircraft, yet their chief engineer, Hall Hibbard, and his young assistant, Clarence Kelly Johnson, approached Circular Proposal X608 with radical thinking unencumbered by fighter design orthodoxy. Johnson, just 26 years old in 1937, had joined Lockheed fresh from the University of Michigan, where his master's thesis focused on twin-engine aircraft configuration and stability. He understood something that would prove crucial. Achieving 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet required solving an engine power problem that single-engine designs could not overcome. The physics were straightforward but brutal. Piston engines breathe air. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 10,000 feet, pressure drops to 10.1 pounds per square inch. At 20,000 feet, it falls to 6.4 pounds per square inch. An engine at 20,000 feet receives less than half the air it would at sea level. Less air means incomplete combustion, which means less power. A naturally aspirated engine producing 1,000 horsepower at sea level might deliver only 600 horsepower at 20,000 feet. The Army Air Corps wanted sustained 400-mile-per-hour performance at that altitude. The mathematics demanded more power than any single engine of practical size could provide in the thin air of the stratosphere. Johnson's solution was conceptually simple but mechanically complex. Mount 2 engines instead of 1. install turbo superchargers to force compressed air into the engines at altitude, maintaining sea-level power output where other aircraft suffocated. The turbo supercharger was not a new invention. General Electric Company had developed the technology during World War I under the direction of engineer Sanford Moss. The device used exhaust gases from the engine to spin a turbine at extremely high speeds, up to 24,000 revolutions per minute. This turbine drove a compressor that forced additional air into the engine's intake, compensating for thin atmosphere at altitude. Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress bombers would later use turbo superchargers extensively, proving the technology's reliability for large aircraft. But fighters were different. Fighters demanded rapid throttle response, violent maneuvering, and sustained high-power operation. The turbo supercharger added weight, complexity, and potential points of failure. Most fighter designers avoided the technology, preferring mechanically driven superchargers that were lighter and simpler, even though they were less effective at extreme altitudes. Johnson calculated that two Allison V1710 engines, each equipped with General Electric B2 turbo superchargers, could deliver the sustained high-altitude performance the Army specification demanded. The Allison V1710 was a liquid-cooled 12-cylinder engine, arranged in a 60-degree V configuration. In standard form, it produced 1,040 horsepower at sea level. With turbo supercharging, Johnson estimated it could maintain near sea-level power output at altitudes approaching 30,000 feet. But mounting two engines created aerodynamic challenges. Traditional twin-engine aircraft used a central fuselage with engines on the wings, but this configuration created asymmetric thrust problems if one engine failed. Johnson's solution was revolutionary in American fighter design. He proposed a twin-boom configuration. Each engine would be mounted in a separate nacelle, extending rearward from the wing to form a tail boom. The booms would support twin vertical stabilizers and a horizontal stabilizer connecting them. The pilot would sit in a central nacelle between the engines, with the armament concentrated in the nose ahead of the cockpit. This layout provided perfect thrust symmetry. If one engine failed, there was no asymmetric yaw moment trying to spin the aircraft, unlike conventional twin-engine designs. The central nose location for guns eliminated the convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted weapons. All rounds fired from the nose battery traveled the same trajectory, concentrating firepower with devastating effect. Lockheed submitted their Model 22 proposal to the Army Air Corps on June 23, 1937. The design featured a wingspan of 52 feet, length of 37 feet 10 inches, and estimated gross weight of 13,300 pounds. Maximum speed was projected at 417 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The Army evaluated all submitted proposals through the summer of 1937. On June 23, 1937, the Army issued a development contract to Lockheed for one prototype designated XP-38. The contract price was $163,000, barely enough to cover development costs for such an ambitious design. But Lockheed accepted, understanding that success could lead to production contracts worth millions. Construction of the XP-38 prototype began in July 1937 at Lockheed's Burbank facility. The aircraft took shape slowly as engineers solved problems that had never before confronted fighter designers. The turbo supercharger installation proved especially challenging. Each General Electric B2 unit weighed approximately 130 pounds and required careful integration with the engine exhaust system, intake ducting, and control mechanisms. The superchargers mounted in the upper rear section of each engine nacelle, receiving hot exhaust gases through specially designed ducting. Intercoolers positioned in the wing leading edges cooled the compressed air before it entered the engine intake, preventing detonation and improving power output. The cooling system for the Allison engines added further complexity. Liquid-cooled engines required radiators, coolant pumps, and extensive plumbing. Johnson positioned the radiators in the inboard sections of each boom, behind the engines. This placement balanced aerodynamic efficiency against cooling effectiveness. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. a compromise that would require refinement throughout the P-38's development. The airframe itself used all-metal stressed skin construction, advanced for 1938, but becoming standard practice in modern aircraft design. Lockheed used flush riveting on critical surfaces to reduce drag. The wings featured Fowler flaps, which extended rearward and downward, to increase both wing area and camber for improved low-speed handling. Control surfaces used fabric covering over metal frameworks, a weight-saving measure that would later be changed to all-metal construction in production aircraft. Armament for the XP-38 consisted of one 37mm Oldsmobile T9 cannon with 15 rounds and 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns with 200 rounds per gun, all mounted in the nose. This concentration of firepower in a tightly grouped battery represented a significant advantage over aircraft with wing-mounted guns that required convergence adjustments. The prototype reached completion in late December 1938. Lockheed test pilot Marshall Heddle conducted the first flight on January 27, 1939, taking off from March Field in Riverside, California. The flight lasted approximately 34 minutes and revealed both the aircraft's promise and its problems. Heddle reported that the P-38 handled well at low speeds, but exhibited some longitudinal instability at high speeds. The turbo supercharger controls required careful management, engine cooling needed improvement, but the basic concept was sound. The Army Air Corps, impressed by the prototype's potential, requested a cross-country speed demonstration. On February 11, 1939, First Lieutenant Ben Kelsey, Chief of the Army's Fighter Project Section, departed March Field in the XP-38, attempting to set a transcontinental speed record. The flight across the United States demonstrated the aircraft's impressive performance. Kelsey covered the distance from California to New York in 7 hours and 2 minutes, with refueling stops in Texas and Ohio. The elapsed time shattered previous transcontinental records and generated enormous publicity for Lockheed and the Army Air Corps. Then disaster struck during the landing approach at Mitchell Field, New York. As Kelsey reduced power and extended the flaps for landing, both engines quit due to carburetor icing, a problem that had not appeared in California's warmer climate. The XP-38 crashed short of the runway. Kelsey survived with minor injuries, but the prototype was destroyed. The loss of the sole XP-38 could have ended the program. Traditional military procurement might have concluded the design was too risky or complex, but the Army Air Corps, impressed by the speed, demonstration and desperate for high-performance fighters as war clouds gathered over Europe, decided to continue development. On April 27, 1939, the Army ordered 13 YP-38 service test aircraft. The designation change from X for experimental to Y for service test indicated the Army's confidence in the design's potential, despite the prototype's crash. Lockheed engineers used the forced development pause to address problems identified during the XP-38's brief test program. Carburetor icing issues were solved by switching to fuel injection systems that eliminated carburetors entirely. Cooling system improvements included larger radiators and revised ducting. The turbo supercharger installation was refined based on test data, improving reliability and response. Engine power increased as Allison developed improved versions of the V1710, eventually producing variants with ratings exceeding 1,400 horsepower. The YP-38 aircraft featured numerous improvements over the prototype. Wingspan increased slightly to 52 feet, length extended to 37 feet 10 inches. Loaded weight grew to 14,632 pounds as equipment and armor were added. Maximum speed remained impressive at 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, validating Johnson's original performance estimates. But as the YP-38 aircraft entered flight testing in 1940 and 1941, disturbing reports arrived from Europe. The Battle of Britain in summer and fall 1940 saw the Royal Air Force's Spitfires and Hurricanes defeat the Luftwaffe's bomber formations, despite being outnumbered. German fighter tactics emphasized high-speed diving attacks followed by rapid climbs back to altitude. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's premier fighter, could dive at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour. British fighter pilots reported a disturbing phenomenon when pursuing diving Bf-109s. At speeds above 400 miles per hour, some British aircraft experienced violent buffeting and loss of control, a compressibility effect where airflow over wings and tail surfaces approached supersonic speeds, creating shock waves that disrupted normal aerodynamic behavior. The P-38 during high-speed dive tests in 1941 revealed similar problems. At speeds approaching 500 miles per hour in a dive, the aircraft's tail began buffeting violently. Control forces became extremely heavy. In some cases, pilots could not pull out of dives without assistance from the dive recovery flaps later installed. The problem was fundamental. As air accelerates over the curved upper surface of a wing or tail, local velocities can exceed the aircraft's overall speed. At certain combinations of altitude, speed, and angle of attack, these local velocities approach the speed of sound, approximately 661 miles per hour at sea level, but decreasing with altitude. When airflow approaches sonic speed, it creates shock waves that separate the boundary layer, causing buffeting and control problems. Fighter designers called this compressibility, and in 1941, no one fully understood how to solve it. The P-38's sleek, fast design made it particularly susceptible. Its high maximum speed brought it closer to the compressibility threshold than most contemporary fighters. Army test pilots reported that high-speed dives could become unrecoverable if the pilot allowed the aircraft to accelerate beyond certain limits. Lockheed engineers worked frantically to address the compressibility problem while production P-38 aircraft began rolling off assembly lines. The Army Air Corps had ordered 673 P-38 seconds in August 1940, before the first P-38 had even flown, a measure of both confidence in the design and desperation for modern fighters as Europe descended into total war. The initial production P-38 seconds featured further refinements. Armament changed to one 20mm Hispano cannon and 450 caliber machine guns, improving both hitting power and ammunition capacity. Self-sealing fuel tanks were added, along with armor protection for the pilot. Radios and other equipment were upgraded to military standards. Maximum gross weight climbed to 15,500 pounds, but engine power increased proportionally, maintaining performance. Then came December 7, 1941. Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, destroying much of America's Pacific Fleet and killing over 2,400 Americans. The United States entered World War II facing enemies on two fronts, with a military still transitioning from peacetime to wartime footing. The P-38's high-altitude capability, long range, and heavy armament suddenly transformed from interesting specifications into critical national necessities. The first P-38 seconds arrived in England in June 1942, assigned to the 1st Fighter Group of the 8th Air Force. These aircraft represented America's first attempt to take the air war directly to Germany, with escort fighters capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. But the initial operational experience was disastrous. The European climate proved far harsher than California testing grounds. British weather, with its constant moisture, cold temperatures, and icing conditions, revealed problems that had never appeared during development. The cockpit heating system was inadequate. Pilots flying at 25,000 feet in unheated or poorly heated cockpits suffered frostbite on their hands and feet during missions lasting 3 or 4 hours. Several pilots were hospitalized with cold injuries after missions. The British-made oxygen systems installed in early aircraft froze at high altitude, cutting off oxygen flow and causing pilots to lose consciousness. At least 2 P-38 seconds were lost when pilots blacked out, from hypoxia, and crashed. Engine problems multiplied in the cold, damp European environment. The Allison V-17-10 engine had been designed for American conditions. In the moisture-saturated air over northern Europe, condensation formed inside the engine and supercharger systems, freezing at altitude and causing catastrophic failures. The cooling systems that had worked adequately in testing proved marginal in combat. When pilots pushed the engines to maximum power during combat, coolant temperatures soared. Several engines seized from overheating during dogfights. The turbo supercharger intercoolers, designed to cool compressed air before it entered the engines, became ice collectors. Ice forming in the intercooler passages restricted airflow, reducing power output precisely when pilots needed maximum performance. The 8th Air Force temporarily grounded its P-38 seconds in November 1942, while Lockheed engineers worked desperately to solve the cold weather problems. New cockpit heating systems were designed and installed. Electric heating elements were added to critical engine components. Improved intercooler designs with better drainage reduced icing. Modified oil systems maintained proper lubrication in extreme cold. By January 1943, the P-38 seconds returned to operations with most cold weather issues resolved or mitigated. But the aircraft's reputation had been damaged. Some Army Air Force commanders questioned whether the complex twin-engine design was suitable for European combat. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean theatre, P-38 seconds were proving devastatingly effective. The 14th Fighter Group began operations from North Africa in November 1942, and the warm, dry climate suited the Lightning perfectly. Without the cold weather problems that plagued European operations, the P-38's performance advantages became immediately apparent. The turbo supercharger installation that had caused so many problems in England worked flawlessly in the clear skies over Tunisia and Libya. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, where German and Italian fighters struggled, the P-38 seconds operated with full power and complete control. German Messerschmitt Bf-109 pilots discovered they could no longer climb above Allied fighters to set up diving attacks, their preferred tactic since the Battle of Britain. The Allison engines with their turbo superchargers maintained power output that German fighters simply could not match. A Bf-109G2, the variant most commonly encountered in North Africa in early 1943, produced 1,475 horsepower at sea level from its Daimler-Benz 605 AM engine. But at 25,000 feet, power output fell to approximately 850 horsepower, a 42% reduction. The P-38G, entering service in late 1942, mounted Allison V-17 1089 engines, rated at 1,325 horsepower at sea level. With turbo supercharging, these engines maintained approximately 1,100 horsepower at 25,000 feet, just a 17% power loss compared to sea level performance. The mathematics of this power differential transformed combat dynamics. A Bf-109 at 25,000 feet with 850 horsepower available was attempting to maneuver an aircraft weighing approximately 7,000 pounds. Power-to-weight ratio was 0.12 horsepower per pound. A P-38G at the same altitude with 2,200 horsepower total from both engines, maneuvering an aircraft weighing 17,500 pounds loaded, had a power-to-weight ratio of 0.126 horsepower per pound. The P-38 actually had superior power loading at altitude despite being much heavier, a reversal of the usual relationship where lighter fighters held performance advantages. But the real advantage appeared in sustained high-altitude operations. German pilots pushing their engines to maximum power at altitude faced rapidly climbing cylinder head temperatures and declining oil pressure. Daimler-Benz engines, superb designs in many respects, had been optimized for performance between sea level and 15,000 feet, the altitudes where most European combat occurred. Above 20,000 feet, they were operating beyond their optimal envelope. The Allison-powered P-38 seconds, designed specifically for high-altitude interception, operated comfortably at 25,000 feet and could fight effectively above 30,000 feet if required. The turbo superchargers delivered cool, dense air to the engines, maintaining proper combustion and preventing detonation. Engine temperatures remained within normal limits, even at maximum continuous power. On March 2, 1943, a formation of 36 Junkers Ju-88 bombers, escorted by approximately 40 Bf-109 fighters, approached Allied positions near Medellin, Tunisia. The Germans were flying at 22,000 feet, an altitude they considered safe from effective interception based on their experience fighting British Spitfires and American P-42s, both of which struggled above 20,000 feet. The 1st Fighter Group's P-38 seconds patrolling at 26,000 feet, had a 4,000-foot altitude advantage and attacked from above, achieving complete surprise. The German formation scattered. German bomber crews, trained to expect protection from their escort fighters, found themselves under attack from American fighters that had simply climbed above the entire German formation. The Bf-109 pilots attempted to climb to engage the P-38 seconds, but found their aircraft struggling in the thin air. What followed was not a dogfight in the traditional sense, but a one-sided engagement where American pilots controlled every aspect of the combat. Second Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey, of the 94th Fighter Squadron, described the engagement in his combat report filed that evening. "We had altitude advantage and attacked from the sun. The 109s tried to climb to us but couldn't make it. We dove through their formation, picked targets, and climbed back above them before they could react. At that altitude, we had all the advantages: speed, climb, and power. They were wallowing around, trying to catch us while we set up attack after attack." The engagement resulted in 11 confirmed German aircraft destroyed with no American losses. More significantly, it demonstrated to Luftwaffe commanders that their fighters could no longer dominate the high-altitude environment. Reports from German pilots after the Medellin engagement revealed frustration and confusion. One pilot from Jagdgeschwader 77 wrote in his diary, later captured and translated by Allied intelligence, "The American twin-engine fighters appear above us, as if by magic. When we attempt to climb to engage them, our aircraft lose power and become sluggish. The Americans dive through our formation at speeds we cannot match, then climb away before we can respond. At these altitudes, we are helpless. The technical advantage they possess is overwhelming." This was the psychological shift moment that German tactical doctrine had not prepared for. Since the Spanish Civil War in 1936, Luftwaffe fighter tactics had emphasized altitude advantage. German pilots were trained to climb above their opponents, then attack from superior position using speed and surprise. The tactics worked brilliantly against Soviet I-16 fighters in Spain, against French and British fighters in 1940, and against early Soviet fighters in 1941 and 1942. But the tactics required the ability to outclimb opponents and maintain superior altitude. Against P-38 seconds, German fighters could not achieve altitude superiority, and without it, their entire tactical system collapsed. The technical reasons for the P-38's high-altitude dominance became clearer as captured Luftwaffe technical reports reached Allied intelligence officers. German aviation engineers understood turbo-supercharging in theory. They had experimented with turbocharged engines as early as 1918, but German fighter design philosophy had rejected turbo-superchargers for single-seat fighters as too complex and unreliable. Instead, German designers used mechanically driven superchargers, where engine power directly drove the compressor through gearing. This approach was simpler and more reliable, but fundamentally limited in altitude performance. A mechanically driven supercharger consumes engine power to operate. The compressor might require 100 to 150 horsepower to drive at maximum boost pressure. This power comes directly from the engine's output, reducing net available power. At sea level, using 150 horsepower to drive the supercharger might enable the engine to produce an additional 300 horsepower, a net gain of 150 horsepower. But at altitude, the efficiency equation changes. The thin air means the supercharger must spin faster and work harder to compress the same volume of air. Power consumption increases, while the additional power produced decreases. At 25,000 feet, a mechanically driven supercharger might consume 200 horsepower, while only enabling an additional 200 horsepower output, resulting in zero net gain. The turbo supercharger solved this problem elegantly by using waste energy. Exhaust gases that would otherwise be vented overboard instead drove the turbine. This energy was essentially free, requiring no power from the engine's crankshaft. The turbo supercharger could compress air at altitude without reducing net engine power output. The General Electric B-2 turbo superchargers in the P-38's Allison engines operated at approximately 24,000 1,000 revolutions per minute at full boost. The turbine temperature reached approximately 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. These extreme operating conditions required exotic materials and precise manufacturing, contributing to the unit's complexity and cost. But the performance benefits at altitude justified the expense. German engineers understood these principles. What they lacked was the industrial infrastructure and material science to build reliable turbo-superchargers at mass production scales. American industry, led by General Electric, had spent millions of dollars developing turbo-supercharger technology through the 1920s and 30s. By 1942, GE was producing turbo-superchargers by the thousands, with proven reliability and established manufacturing processes. Germany focused on mechanically supercharged engines that worked well for their tactical doctrine of medium-altitude operations, had not invested equivalently in turbo-supercharger development. This decision, logical in 1938 when German fighters dominated European skies, became a critical weakness by 1943 when American fighters brought high-altitude capability to the European theater. The impact extended beyond individual dogfights. American bomber formations relied on altitude as their primary defense against flak and fighters. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds typically bombed from 23,000 to 27,000 feet. German fighters attacking these formations had to climb to interception altitude while carrying the weight of ammunition and fuel for extended missions. The climb from airfield altitude to 25,000 feet consumed fuel and time, reducing the duration German fighters could remain in combat. P-38 seconds escorting the bombers could patrol at bomber altitude without power loss, then climb above attacking German fighters with power to spare. This capability inverted the tactical relationship. German fighters, historically the attackers with altitude advantage, became the disadvantaged defenders forced to attack from below against fighters with superior high-altitude performance. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe fighter pilots was profound. Major Günther Rahl, a German ace with 275 confirmed victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, transferred to defense of the Reich operations in late 1943. He encountered P-38 seconds during a mission over Germany on November 26, 1943. His post-war interviews revealed the shock experienced by pilots trained on Eastern Front tactics. We had been told the Americans had good aircraft but lacked tactical skill. This proved half true. Their tactical formations were indeed less sophisticated than ours. But when we attempted to attack their bomber formations from above, as was standard procedure, we found American fighters already positioned above us. The twin-engine Lightnings climbed to 30,000 feet and waited. When we climbed to attack, they dove on us with overwhelming speed. My Messerschmitt, which had served me well against Soviet fighters, felt sluggish and underpowered. At that altitude, I could not maneuver effectively. The Americans controlled the engagement completely. The combat reports from P-38 pilots during late 1943 describe methodical destruction of German formations attempting to attack bomber streams. Captain Arthur Jeffrey of the 55th Fighter Group filed a report after a mission on December 11, 1943, escorting B-17 seconds to Emden, Germany. We maintained position at 28,000 feet, 3,000 feet above the bomber formation. German fighters approached from the south at approximately 24,000 feet, climbing to attack altitude. We dove on them from above with significant speed advantage. The enemy aircraft scattered without engaging the bombers. We pursued individual fighters down to 15,000 feet before breaking off and climbing back to escort altitude. At our operational ceiling, we had overwhelming advantages in power and speed. The engineering details that enabled this tactical dominance were invisible to German pilots, but clearly documented in technical reports. The Allison V-17 10 engine's turbo-supercharger system used a wastegate valve to control boost pressure. At low altitude, where the engine produced adequate power naturally, the wastegate remained partially open, allowing some exhaust gas to bypass the turbine and vent overboard normally. As the aircraft climbed and atmospheric pressure decreased, the wastegate gradually closed, directing more exhaust gas through the turbine to maintain intake manifold pressure. At 25,000 feet, the wastegate was fully closed, with all exhaust gas driving the turbine. The compressor wheel, spinning at 24,000 revolutions per minute, compressed incoming air to approximately 42 inches of mercury manifold pressure, roughly 3 times atmospheric pressure at that altitude. This compressed air flowed through intercoolers, positioned in the wing leading edges. The intercoolers reduced air temperature from approximately 300 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving the compressor to approximately 150 degrees Fahrenheit entering the engine. Cooler air is denser, packing more oxygen molecules into each cubic inch, improving combustion and power output, while reducing the risk of destructive detonation. The intercooled compressed air entered the engine's intake manifold at pressure and temperature conditions similar to sea-level atmosphere. The engine operated as if it were at sea level, producing near sea-level power output despite flying at 25,000 feet where unassisted engines suffocated. This technological sophistication came at a cost in complexity and maintenance requirements. Each P-38 had 2 complete turbo supercharger systems, 2 sets of intercoolers, extensive high-temperature ducting, and complex control mechanisms. Maintenance crews required special training to service these systems properly, but once properly maintained, the systems worked reliably. By mid-1943, after cold weather modifications were completed, P-38 engine reliability in combat operations exceeded 90%. Aircraft routinely completed missions lasting 4 hours or more at high altitude without mechanical failures. The contrast with German fighter reliability became stark by late 1943. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters, pushed to maximum performance at altitudes beyond their design optimization, suffered increasing mechanical failures. Engine overheating, cylinder head cracking, and supercharger failures became common as German pilots pushed their aircraft beyond design limits trying to match P-38 performance. Luftwaffe maintenance crews working with worn-out tooling, inadequate spare parts supplies, and undertrained replacement mechanics struggled to maintain serviceability rates above 70% by early 1944. The mathematical implications were devastating. If Germany could maintain 70% of its fighters operational, while America maintained 90% operational, and America was producing 3 times as many aircraft, the imbalance in available combat aircraft became overwhelming. The strategic impact of the P-38's high-altitude capability extended beyond individual combats. American strategic bombing doctrine required deep penetration raids into Germany, targeting industrial facilities, transportation networks, and petroleum production. These raids faced intense opposition from both flak and fighters. Without long-range fighter escort, bomber losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force suspended unescorted deep penetration raids after the disastrous Schweinfurt mission of October 14, 1943, where 60 B-17 seconds were destroyed. Out of 291 dispatched, a 21% loss rate. The P-38, with its turbo-supercharged high-altitude performance and range exceeding 1,000 miles with drop tanks, provided the escort capability that made sustained strategic bombing viable. By January 1944, P-38 groups were regularly escorting bombers to targets throughout Germany. The presence of escorts forced German fighters to engage under unfavorable conditions, fighting American fighters at altitudes where P-38 seconds held decisive advantages. The appearance of the P-38H variant in early 1944, with improved Allison V17 1089 engines producing 1,325 horsepower, further increased the performance gap. Maximum speed at 25,000 feet reached 402 miles per hour. The aircraft could climb to 20,000 feet in 8 minutes. Service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, an altitude where no German fighter could operate effectively. German technical intelligence officers studying captured P-38 seconds and interrogating captured American pilots tried to understand the source of the Lightning's high-altitude superiority. Reports from Luftwaffe testing facilities at Rechlin, obtained after the war, show that German engineers correctly identified the turbo supercharger as the key technology, but but attempts to develop equivalent systems for German fighters failed due to material shortages, manufacturing difficulties, and time constraints. Germany in 1944 lacked the industrial capacity to implement major design changes while sustaining production of existing fighter types. The Luftwaffe's response to the P-38 threat evolved through desperate improvisation rather than systematic technical solution. Focke-Wulf 4 190D9 fighters, entering service in late 1944, used improved supercharging and aerodynamic refinement to reach 426 miles per hour at 21,000 feet. But even these improved aircraft could not match the P-38's high-altitude performance or combat endurance. The psychological dimension of the P-38's impact on German fighter pilots appears repeatedly in post-war accounts and captured documents. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, flying with nggiUmid 11 in defense of the Reich operations, recorded in his diary on January 30, 1944, "The American Lightnings are the devil's own aircraft. They appear above us when we attempt to attack the bomber formations. Our aircraft lack the power to climb above them at these altitudes. We are forced to attack from below, where their speed advantage is overwhelming. I have lost good men to these twin-engine fighters. The technological gap between their aircraft and ours has become a chasm we cannot cross." The final validation of the P-38's turbo-supercharged superiority came during the battles for air supremacy over Germany in early 1944. Operation Argument, known to crews as Big Week, launched on February 20, 1944, targeting German aircraft production facilities across the Reich. The 8th Air Force dispatched over 1,000 bombers on each of 5 days, escorted by every available fighter, including 16 P-38 groups. The Luftwaffe responded with maximum effort, launching hundreds of interceptors to defend critical industrial targets. The resulting air battles, fought at altitudes between 22,000 and 30,000 feet, represented the decisive test of high-altitude fighter performance. The P-38 groups claimed 107 German aircraft destroyed during Big Week operations. More significantly, they forced German fighters to engage under conditions where every technical advantage belonged to the Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins, commanding the 55th Fighter Group, filed an after-action report on February 22, 1944, following a mission to Oschersleben. Enemy fighters attempted to attack the bomber formation from high altitude. Our P-38 seconds, positioned at 30,000 feet, intercepted them during their approach climb. The enemy aircraft were struggling at that altitude, engines losing power, controls becoming sluggish. We dove through them repeatedly. They could not maneuver effectively. Many German pilots broke off their attacks without ever reaching the bombers. The altitude advantage provided by our turbo superchargers made this mission a systematic destruction of enemy forces rather than an evenly matched combat. The combat film from Jenkins' gun camera, preserved in the National Archives, shows the engagement with brutal clarity. German Bf-109 fighters appear in the frame, climbing slowly, contrails streaming from their wingtips as they struggle through the thin air at 29,000 feet. The P-38 seconds dive from above, with speed advantage exceeding 100 miles per hour. The German fighters attempt evasive maneuvers, but their responses are slow, almost lazy, as pilots fight controls that require excessive force at altitude where their aircraft lack power. The P-38 seconds roll through firing passes and climb away effortlessly, engines delivering full power through their turbo superchargers, while German engines gasp for air. German losses during Big Week totaled approximately 220 fighters, according to Luftwaffe records captured after the war. Many pilots who survived the combats reported frustration at their inability to engage American escorts effectively. The technical reports filed by German unit commanders reveal the depth of their disadvantage. nggiUmid 2 reported on February 25, 1944, "Our aircraft are unable to maintain effective combat at altitudes above 25,000 feet. Enemy fighters, particularly the twin-engine Lightning types, operate comfortably at these altitudes and attack with overwhelming power advantage. Request immediate technical solution or tactical modifications to address this critical deficiency." No technical solution existed within German industrial capacity in 1944. The Luftwaffe's response involved tactical adaptations that acknowledged American high-altitude superiority. German fighters began attacking bomber formations from below, accepting the disadvantageous position because attacking from above meant encountering P-38 seconds at altitudes where combat was hopeless. This tactical shift forced German pilots to attack through the bomber's defensive fire, increasing losses while reducing effectiveness. The strategic consequences rippled through Germany's war production. With air superiority established over Germany by March 1944, American bombers systematically destroyed aircraft factories, petroleum refineries, and transportation networks. German fighter production, despite heroic efforts by industrial managers, could not replace combat losses while also expanding to meet increasing threats. Monthly fighter production peaked at approximately 3,800 aircraft in September 1944, but losses exceeded production every month from March 1944 onward. The P-38's role in establishing air superiority extended beyond Europe. In the Pacific theater, where long range was even more critical than in Europe, P-38 seconds provided the only fighter capable of escorting bombers across the vast distances between island bases and targets deep in Japanese-held territory. The aircraft's turbo-supercharged high-altitude performance proved less critical in the Pacific, where most combat occurred below 20,000 feet. But the twin-engine reliability and long range made the P-38 invaluable for missions over hundreds of miles of open ocean. Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories, flew P-38 seconds exclusively throughout his combat career in the Pacific. His after-action report consistently emphasized the aircraft's reliability during long overwater missions. "I trusted the P-38 completely," Bong wrote in a letter to Lockheed engineers in July 1944. "Two engines meant if one failed, you could get home. The range meant we could escort bombers anywhere they needed to go. The concentrated nose armament meant hits were devastating. The turbo superchargers meant we always had power available when needed, whether at altitude or in emergency situations at lower levels." The turbo supercharger technology that made the P-38 possible influenced American aircraft design for decades. The lessons learned, developing and operating the Allison turbo supercharger combination, informed post-war piston engine development and eventually contributed to early turbojet design principles. The B-29 Superfortress, designed to bomb Japan from high altitude, used 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each equipped with General Electric turbo superchargers. These systems allowed B-29 seconds to operate at 32,000 feet, safely above most Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighters. The B-29 seconds that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 relied on turbo supercharger technology directly descended from the systems developed for the P-38. Post-war American fighter development moved toward turbojet engines, which use turbine-driven compressors inherently, making separate turbo superchargers unnecessary. But the engineering understanding developed through P-38 turbo supercharger operations informed early jet engine design. The principles of compressing air to maintain power at altitude, managing heat through intercooling, and controlling power output through fuel flow remained fundamental. Engineers who had worked on P-38 power plants moved to jet engine development programs, carrying their knowledge forward. The P-38 itself remained in service with the United States Air Force until 1949 and with foreign air forces into the 1950s. Total production reached 9,923 aircraft between 1941 and 1945. Lockheed's Burbank facility alone employed over 90,000 workers at peak production, many of them women entering the workforce for the first time as part of the wartime mobilization. The Lightning, as it became universally known, served in every theater of World War II and established performance records that would stand for years. The technical legacy proved more significant than the operational service record. The P-38 demonstrated that complex technology, when properly developed and integrated, could provide decisive tactical advantages. The turbo supercharger systems that seemed too complex for fighter aircraft in 1937 proved reliable and effective by 1943, providing capabilities no simpler system could match. The concentrated nose armament concept influenced post-war fighter design. Guns mounted in the nose with no convergence issues became standard practice once cannon and machine gun installations were perfected. Modern fighters continue to mount their cannons in the fuselage centerline, a direct inheritance from the P-38's layout. The twin-boom configuration, revolutionary in American fighter design when Johnson proposed it in 1937, reappeared in the Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighter, and later in the Fairchild, a 10 Thunderbolt, two close air support aircraft. While not common, the configuration proved viable for specific applications where centralized armament and efficient use of internal volume mattered. The human cost of the P-38's combat operations appears in the casualty records preserved at the National Archives. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 135 P-38 seconds to enemy action during operations over Europe. Pacific theater losses totaled approximately 170 P-38 seconds. Each loss represented a trained pilot, months of training investment, and accumulated combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. But the losses were sustainable because American industrial production provided replacement aircraft faster than combat consumed them. Lockheed delivered P-38 seconds at rates exceeding 200 per month during peak production periods in 1944. German fighter production, even at maximum effort, could not match American output while simultaneously replacing catastrophic losses on all fronts. The mathematics of attrition warfare, brutal but decisive, favored the side that could sustain both production and training pipelines while absorbing losses. The pilots who flew the P-38 combat developed deep respect for the aircraft despite its complexity and quirks. The cockpit was spacious compared to single-engine fighters, reducing fatigue during long missions. The twin engines provided psychological comfort during overwater operations. The nose-mounted armament made gunnery straightforward, but most importantly, the turbo-supercharged performance gave pilots confidence they could survive combat by outclimbing or outrunning threats when necessary. Colonel Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group which flew P-47 Thunderbolts, flew P-38 seconds during a temporary assignment and compared the two aircraft in a private letter to his wife. The Lightning is a pilot's aircraft. It requires attention and skill to fly well. The turbo-supercharger controls must be managed carefully. The engines need monitoring, but when flown properly, it provides capabilities no other fighter matches. At altitude, nothing can touch it. The German pilots fear it, and with good reason. Our boys who fly P-38 seconds love them. They understand that the aircraft's complexity gives them the advantages that keep them alive. The German perspective on the P-38 evolved from initial dismissal to grudging respect to genuine concern. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1942 described the Lightning as interesting but flawed, too large and too complex to be an effective dogfighter. By late 1943, reports acknowledged the aircraft's high-altitude superiority and recommended avoiding combat above 25,000 feet. By early 1944, reports warned pilots that engaging P-38 seconds at any altitude above 20,000 feet was tactically inadvisable without significant numerical superiority. The final German assessment, compiled by the Luftwaffe's Tactical Assessment Section in March 1945, concluded bluntly that American technological superiority in turbo-supercharger development had provided decisive advantages that German industry could not counter within wartime constraints. The report recommended that future fighter development prioritize high-altitude performance through whatever means possible, acknowledging that Germany had lost the technical competition for air superiority above 20,000 feet. The story of the P-38 and its turbo-superchargers ultimately illustrates a fundamental truth about technological warfare. Superior technology provides advantage only when it can be produced in adequate quantities, maintained in field conditions, and operated by trained personnel who understand its capabilities. The P-38 succeeded not because turbo-superchargers were a revolutionary new invention, they had existed since World War I, but because American industry could manufacture them reliably at scale, American maintenance systems could keep them functioning in combat theaters, and American pilots could exploit the performance advantages they provided. German engineering, justly famous for quality and sophistication, produced aircraft that were often superior to their Allied counterparts in specific performance metrics. The Bf 109 series evolved continuously, each variant improving on the previous. The 4190 offered performance and handling that impressed Allied test pilots who flew captured examples. But German aircraft suffered from industrial constraints that limited production, from supply chains that could not deliver adequate spare parts, and from pilot training programs that collapsed under attrition's relentless pressure. The P-38's turbo superchargers required skilled maintenance, adequate supplies of specialized parts, and pilots trained to manage complex engine systems. America provided all these elements through industrial capacity that dwarfed Germany's logistics networks that supplied theaters on opposite sides of the world simultaneously, and training programs that graduated thousands of new pilots annually with hundreds of hours of flight time each. Technology and industrial capacity combined to create advantages that tactical brilliance alone could not overcome. The pilots who encountered P-38 seconds in combat carried memories of those engagements for the rest of their lives. Franz Stigler, the Luftwaffe pilot who had watched P-38 seconds operate above his Messerschmitt's ceiling on that December morning in 1943, survived the war and immigrated to Canada. In a 1978 interview for a documentary on World War II aviation, he reflected on the technological gap that had become apparent in the war's final years. "We were good pilots in good aircraft, but the Americans had better technology and unlimited numbers. We could not match that performance. No amount of courage or skill could compensate for the technical advantage they possessed. When I saw those twin-boomed fighters above me at 25,000 feet, maintaining formation effortlessly while my engine struggled, I understood the war was lost. Their technology had surpassed ours, and we lacked the industrial capacity to close the gap." The veterans who flew P-38 seconds in combat spoke with pride about the aircraft's capabilities and their own roles in achieving air superiority. Robert de Haven, who scored 14 confirmed victories flying P-38 seconds in the Pacific, told interviewers at a reunion of the 49th Fighter Group in 1992, "The Lightning gave us every advantage we needed: speed, firepower, range, and altitude performance. We trusted our aircraft completely. When we engaged Japanese fighters, we knew our engines would deliver full power no matter what altitude we fought at." That confidence made the difference between aggressive tactics and defensive flying. We could press attacks because we knew we could escape if necessary. The turbo superchargers were complex, but they worked, and they gave us superiority in the vertical plane that won fights. The technical achievements represented by the P-38's turbo supercharger installation remain impressive even from the perspective of modern engineering. The General Electric B-2 turbo supercharger, spinning at 24,000 revolutions per minute while handling exhaust gases at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, operated reliably for hundreds of hours between overhauls. The intercooler systems cooled compressed air by 150 degrees in a compact package mounted in the wing leading edge. The control systems allowed pilots to manage boost pressure across the aircraft's entire operating envelope from sea level to over 40,000 feet. Modern aircraft use electronic engine controls and digital systems to manage power output, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Compressing intake air to maintain power at altitude, managing heat through efficient cooling, and controlling power output to match mission requirements, these challenges that Lockheed engineers solved in the late 1930s still define high-performance aircraft design today. The P-38 proved that complexity could be reliable when properly engineered, that advanced technology could be manufactured at scale when industry committed adequate resources, and that performance advantages from superior technology could prove decisive when operational doctrine exploited them effectively. The Luftwaffe never expected American fighters to dominate the high-altitude environment above 25,000 feet. German tactical doctrine, developed through successful campaigns in Spain, Poland, France, and Russia, assumed German fighters would control the vertical dimension of combat. The appearance of P-38 seconds operating comfortably at altitudes where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs struggled shattered this assumption and forced tactical adaptations that degraded German defensive effectiveness. The turbo-superchargers that made this possible represented not just a technical achievement but a triumph of industrial vision. American engineers and industrialists invested in complex technology that most experts considered too difficult for fighter application. They persevered through development problems, operational failures, and initial skepticism. They created manufacturing processes that produced thousands of these complex units with consistent quality. They established logistics and maintenance systems that kept the systems functioning under combat conditions. The result was an aircraft that transformed Allied air operations, provided capabilities German technology could not match, and contributed materially to achieving the air superiority that made strategic bombing possible and invasion sustainable. On December 28, 1943, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler returned to base after his encounter with P-38 seconds above Osnabrück. He filed a combat report noting American fighters at 25,000 feet, operating with power and control his Messerschmitt could not match at that altitude. He recommended his unit avoid combat above 22,000 feet until technical improvements could address the performance gap. His recommendation was noted, filed, and ultimately ignored because no technical improvements were possible within Germany's shrinking industrial capacity and collapsing supply chains. The P-38 seconds continued operating at altitudes where German fighters suffocated, escorting bombers deep into Germany, establishing air superiority through technological advantage that tactical skill alone could not overcome. The humble turbo-supercharger, a technology German engineers understood but could not implement at scale, had transformed the air war, not through revolutionary invention, but through systematic engineering, industrial commitment, and operational application. The Luftwaffe had not expected 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet to be achievable by a twin-engine fighter. They had not anticipated American industry could produce complex turbo-superchargers by the thousands. They had not foreseen that control of the high-altitude environment would prove decisive in the struggle for air superiority. The P-38 Lightning, with its turbo-supercharged Allison engines and twin-boom configuration, proved them wrong on every count. It demonstrated that superior technology, reliably produced and effectively employed, could provide advantages that courage and skill could not overcome. It showed that the vertical dimension of combat belonged to whichever side could maintain power at altitude. And it validated Kelly Johnson's radical design from 1937, proving that an untried configuration built around complex technology could become one of the war's most effective fighters. The twin-boomed aircraft that skeptics dismissed as too complex, too heavy, and too unusual became the aircraft that German pilots learned to fear and respect. The turbo-superchargers that traditionalists considered too unreliable for fighters proved decisive in establishing American air superiority. Sometimes the most valuable innovations come not from following accepted practice, but from challenging assumptions and investing in technology others dismiss. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.